Starting live in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good morning, everybody. My name is John Green. I'm the interim director of the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the 2021 State of the Parties Conference. The Bliss Institute has organized this conference since the fall of 1993, but this year is the first time that we're offering the conference in a virtual format rather than in an in-person format. Who knows, this may be the way of the future when it comes to conferences. This is the first panel of the conference, and it is entitled The Public and Partisan Polarization, and is scheduled between 10 a.m. and 11:45 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. We have 4 fascinating papers on this topic, which we will turn to momentarily. But first, let me cover some logistics. Each of our presenters will speak to us and show their findings for approximately 15 minutes. And when all of the presentations are completed, we will turn to Q&A. If you would like to submit a question for during the presentations or really any time, feel free to do that via chat. And I will do my best to get all the questions asked. Some of the papers presented on this panel and throughout the conference have multiple authors, but for logistical reasons, we have just one of those authors making the presentation. But it's important to know that much of this work is collective in nature. The bios of the presenters and copies of their papers are available on the conference website. And now we're ready for our first presentation. Our first presenter is Professor Alan Abramowitz of Emory University, and the title of his paper is Peak Polarization, Ideological Division, Inter-Party Hostility, and the Future of American Democracy. Professor Abramowitz, please proceed.
Thank you very much, John. And I'm delighted to be here for this State of the Parties conference. I've enjoyed these conferences very much in the past in person, and I'm very much looking forward to participating this year. I'm going to talk about my research on the development of partisan polarization in the United States, particularly on the most recent election cycle, and how we've seen that evolve and develop to the point where I'm now talking about this, or raising the question of whether we have reached the point of peak polarization, because it's a little bit frightening to think that it could get even worse than it is now. So let me talk about this research. The questions that I'm trying to address here with this research are basically trying to explain some of the dramatic changes in American voting behavior that we've seen over the past 30 to 40 years, including increased party loyalty among voters, going along with that, a decline in the personal vote and the advantage of incumbency in elections at virtually all levels, but particularly in Congress. The decline in the proportion of swing voters in election, that is the proportion of voters who actually switch sides between elections, and increased straight ticket voting as well, where we're seeing much greater consistency in vote choice from the top of the ticket on down. What is it that explains these very dramatic developments in American electoral behavior? I'm going to argue today that one of the most important factors that has contributed to these trends that we're seeing is the rise of what I call partisan ideological consistency. I'm going to present evidence, just to give you a quick overview, from ANES surveys going back several decades, showing that the correlations among ideological identification, issue positions, and party identification have increased dramatically over the past 50 years. Then I'm going to focus in on the 2020 American National Election Studies survey to show that I think there's very strong evidence that at this point, a single underlying left, right, or liberal conservative dimension largely explains the policy preferences of ordinary Americans. I show that the distribution of preferences on this left-right issue scale is highly polarized, with Democrats on the left and Republicans on the right. And finally, I show that location on this left-right issue scale strongly influences both affective evaluations of presidential candidates and parties and voter decision-making in the 2020 election. So first, let me show you a table that tracks trends in partisan ideological consistency over time. These are items that are available going way back. There aren't that many of them, but if we look at the correlations between, for example, party ID and ideological ID, or between party ID and opinion on government role in health insurance, party ID and abortion opinion, which doesn't go back quite as far. These are some items that we do have available going all the way back to the 1970s or 80s. And you can see here, these are product moment correlations. And by the way, on the 7-point scales, I've placed the respondents who opted out of the question in the middle to avoid having large quantities of missing data, which could really throw off the results. But quick summary here is what you see is that the correlations have gotten a lot stronger over time. One of the consequences of this, as the party ID ideology correlation has gotten stronger, and here we're just talking about self-identification, you can see that the average location of Democratic and Republican identifiers has pulled apart pretty dramatically over time, with Democrats moving to the left or down here on the scale, and Republicans moving to the right or higher on the scale, which goes from 1 to 7. Now, focusing in on the 2020 ANES, the advantage of ANES data in 2020 is it has a very large number of issue questions that enable us to create all these separate policy scales. So what I'm showing you here are the correlations between opinions in six policy domains: cultural issues, immigration, racial justice, gun control, climate change, and social welfare, along with ideological identification. And as you can see here, these correlations are very strong. So we're seeing a great deal of consistency in opinions across different policy domains, something that, of course, was not the case 40 or 50 years ago. Much greater consistency. The result of that is all these issue positions can be put together to create a single left-right policy scale, much as we create a left-right policy scale for members of Congress. And what we see here are the locations of Biden and Trump voters on that left-right scale. And as you can see, while there is some overlap, there is a very sharp demarcation between the average locations of Biden and Trump voters, with relatively little overlap, with Democratic or Biden voters overwhelmingly on the left, Trump voters overwhelmingly on the right. This table shows the correlation between that issue scale and party identification for various subgroups. And overall, the correlation between the issue scale and party ID is 0.755, which is very strong. Those of you who work with survey data will undoubtedly recognize that that is a very strong correlation, but it does vary somewhat depending on level of education, political interest and attention, political activism. What's striking here to me, however, is that even among those with less education, for example, those with only a high school education, the correlations are still quite strong. It seems that partisan ideological consistency is something that in the current year is not confined to a small minority of the public, the highly educated, the politically engaged. It is really something that's quite widespread within the American electorate. Something else that's trended over time, or changed over time, has been affective polarization. This table just shows the trend in the mean difference in feeling thermometer ratings, that's on the 0 to 100 feeling thermometer scale, between the ratings of one's own party and the opposing party, and between one's own presidential candidate and the opposing presidential candidate for all party identifiers, including leaners. And you can see how that has increased over time from only a 20-degree difference back in 1968, the first time it was asked for presidential candidates, to now 60-degree difference in in 2020. But it didn't just start with, Trump. This goes way back. This is something that's been trending upward for quite a long time. And what we also see over time is that as affective polarization has increased, so have the correlation between ideological identification and these feeling thermometer ratings of the candidates and parties. So there's an increasing consistency between where you place yourself on the left-right self-identification scale, which we have going back to 1972, and your feeling thermometer ratings, your feelings toward the parties and candidates. This is a graph that shows the relationship between location on the left-right issue scale that I created in 2020, which is a much better measure of ideology than simple self-identification, and your relative ratings of the presidential candidates and parties in 2020. You can see there is a very strong relationship there. In fact, the correlation is roughly 0.8 between left-right self location on this issue scale and feeling thermometer ratings of the parties and candidates. So left-right location, it turns out, is a very powerful predictor of feelings toward presidential candidates, and in this case, feelings toward the incumbent president. This table shows the relationship between where you are located on the left-right issue scale, whether you're left of center, roughly in the center, within plus or minus 0.5 standard deviations of the center, and right of center, and your rating of Donald Trump on the scale. And overall, you can see that there is a very strong relationship here. But what's more important, and the main point I'm trying to make here, is that this holds even within various demographic groups that we think of as being aligned with one party or the other. For example, among evangelical white Christians, who tend to be a very conservative group overall, nonetheless, among those who are in the center or left of center, their ratings of Trump are far lower than among the larger group who are right of center. Same thing with those who identify as LGBT, who tend to be a much more liberal group, but those who are right of center, like Donald Trump, there are conservative LGBT voters, and they actually like Donald Trump. So my point here is simply that ideology overrides all of these other group identities. It also has a powerful influence on consistency of voter decision making, even when we control for party identification. Whether you vote consistently for your own party's candidates depends very much on whether you are located where you are on this scale. And so left of center Democrats and right of center Republicans vote overwhelmingly and consistently for their own party's candidates for president, House, and Senate. But those in the center not nearly as consistently. And those who are on kind of the opposite side from their party, which is a small minority, but there are some, they do not vote at all consistently for their party. They often cross party lines, but they're a very small group. So quickly, conclusions and implications. I'm arguing that the reason so many Americans intensely dislike those on the other side of the partisan divide is that they consistently disagree with those on the other side of the partisan divide. Similarly, party loyalty and straight ticket voting reflect ideological conflict. The reason Democrats and Republicans are unwilling to cross party lines in elections is that they disagree with almost everything that the opposing party stands for. Hostility toward the opposing party and its leaders reflects strong disagreement with the policies of the opposing party and its leaders. In other words, there's a rational policy foundation to this affective polarization. And as long as the parties remain on opposite sides of almost all major issues, those feelings of animosity and mistrust are unlikely to diminish, regardless of Donald Trump's future role in the Republican Party. Finally, one implication of this is that there are very few persuadable voters left. So turnout is the major focus of campaigns these days rather than persuasion. There are still a few swing voters, and they can matter in close elections, but overall, turnout is the major focus of campaigns now rather than persuasion. I wanted to say very quickly about what happened in Virginia and New Jersey, because some people might be saying, aha, but what about the big swings that we saw in Virginia and New Jersey? And which seems to maybe contradict some of the points I'm making. But what actually happened there, at least, and we know this clearly for Virginia because there's an exit poll there, is that there were very few voters who switched sides between 20 and 21. You might think that lots of voters actually flipped, but that was not the case this was all about turnout. It was all about turnout. The electorate in 2021 in Virginia was a very different electorate from those who turned out to vote in 2020 in terms of race, age, and therefore partisanship and ideology. So I'll stop there, and I'll be glad to take your questions later. And I have no idea how this slide got into my presentation, but so I will apologize to any Houston Astros fans who might be out there. I'm looking at you, Ron Rappaport.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Abramowitz, for that great presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our second presenter, who is Eric Wurst from the University of Missouri at St. Louis. And his presentation is entitled #Polarize 2020, Divisions and Duress in Partisan Perceptions of COVID-19. Professor Duress, please proceed.
Thank you, John. Thank you, fellow panelists, Kimberly as well, and the Bliss Institute at large. I'm always excited to be a part of this conference. This is such a wonderful conference. Also, a big thank you to Lindenwood University as essentially an independent researcher at this point. They've provided a lot of resources for access to IRB approval, things like that. Also, an acknowledgement very quickly to Dave Robertson and my father, Carl Vorst, both of whom passed away recently. I just want to bring them up because they were both incredible role models, incredible mentors, big part of why I'm here today. Also, hello to my 150 to 180 students. I've lost track at this point. Watching in the recording of this, there's a lot of excellent research and on this panel, and we're talking about political polarization this week in my classes, so perfect timing. Got a lot to cover from this, so I'd like to really sort of explain to you all the scope of what we're trying to answer here. May have to go through some of these slides really quickly, but I'll be happy to answer any questions along the way. So this idea sort of spawned early in 2020. Thomas Leith, my co-author, was at the time one of my students at in a interdisciplinary research cluster at Lindenwood University. And he was kind of probing this idea that many of us were seeing, that people's responses to this emerging pandemic did not seem very consistent. We started seeing sort of a Democrat perspective or liberal perspective on what we needed to do versus a Republican or more conservative. I recall telling some of my students, once we start getting politics into this, we might be in for a rough time. So this is where this idea spawned. I asked Thomas if he wanted to expand on the paper more, and he was eager to do so. So this is what we have. One of the things we noticed is that there was a break. We started to see these obvious breaks on how Republicans and Democrats felt that we needed to react to the coronavirus, COVID-19, over the span of a year. And these are just some summary data, pretty much to highlight what many of us have already observed. We also saw that a lot of this broke down regionally by the states. So one fascinating thing that Thomas came across is there was almost a direct match with state by state approval or wanting to wear masks, along with the electoral map of 2020. So we saw a lot of these things across many different variables. So really what we're looking at here, what we're asking, is we want to know the ways that polarization in the electorate influence the way people sort of assess these risks of a global pandemic. Not just the way they assess a risk, but assess what the right way is to mitigate those risks. So these are really big questions. I mean, we're dealing with, obviously, a global pandemic, one that we haven't seen a scale of which for 100 years now. So how is this phenomenon of polarization, political polarization, going to affect this? And we have a few expectations. Generally speaking, we expected to see a positive relationship between someone's ideology and whether they're going to accept a statement being made about what the proper way to approach this pandemic through policy. We expected a similar correlation with affect towards the person making the statement. We also introduced kind of this so what aspect to this research, where we sort of looked at what this impact was on social media, specifically Twitter. So the core of our research is an original survey that we created called Policy Responses to COVID-19. And we ended up with approximately 2,000 participants, went through the IRB approval process, and split our participants into two groups. We got our control and our test. And the core dependent variable is whether or not these participants agreed or disagreed with these series of statements on a scale of 1 to 100. And they were presented with 16 statements. And what we did, actually I'll show the control group first, we gave them 4 statements. We said, well, these next 6 statements were made by Donald Trump. And the first 4 statements they read were indeed made by Donald Trump. The 5th and 6th statements were actually made by Anthony Fauci. So this is kind of a first deception that we threw in there. The same was true for Joe Biden's statements. You know, here are 6 statements made by Joe Biden. The last 2 were actually made by Anthony Fauci. With the test group, we kind of, we didn't just fool them once, we fooled them twice. So I would say shame on them, but that's not very nice because they were all very good participants. What we did is we actually switched the attribution in the first 4 questions or statements. We said, hey, Donald Trump said these things. They were actually said by Joe Biden. And then we said, Donald Trump made these statements. They were actually made by Anthony Fauci. So we have 2 different manipulations that we saw theoretically, methodologically, that we could compare. And really because what we were interested in also is what is the effect, not just of affect, but what's the effect of priming. So if we could combine, our goal was really to combine these 2 effects and see if we could pull out kind of some interesting data out of that. So again, if we tell you that Donald Trump made a series of statements, he actually did make those statements, but then we have primed you to have you respond to whether or not you agree with Anthony Fauci. So the idea is, does affect affect our ability or our tendency to agree with the recommendations of a nationally recognized expert in infectious disease rather than a politician? So this is kind of what we're trying to do with this survey. We have a number of independent variables that we have in this data set. We didn't use all of these in our test, but they are available. We thought it would be good to seize upon this opportunity to gather as much data as we can. A lot of these could be argued to have an effect, even alternate expectations for some of these differences we see, especially measures like trust in the media and government, as well as politicians. And external and internal political efficacy. Those have all been shown in the literature to have some sort of effect. Our core independent variables, our control variables, we took the standard gender, age group, education, etc. I will not read all of these quotes for you. They are available in the paper, but this is an example of the quotes that were presented to each of the respondents. What we tried to do is give 4 Trump quotes and then 4 Fauci quotes that sort of sounded like they could have been said by Trump, with the exception of Trump-like verbal cues. So we kind of tried to play around with that in that respect. Same with Joe Biden. We introduced these Biden quotes and then tried to find Fauci quotes that might have been similar to something you would hear from Joe Biden. Okay, so what did we find? So first, we just took a look at the summary data and looked at whether or not there was a correlation between self-identification of either a strong liberal, which would be 1, or 7, which is a strong conservative. And we saw something that is not very surprising. You know, the strong, self-identified strong liberals were very likely to agree with Joe Biden's statements. And this is in the control group. We're not, there's no manipulation here yet. And as the self-identification became more conservative, respondents were less likely to have agreed with those statements. Now, the interesting thing is when we compare this to the test group. So these are the same exact Joe Biden quotes. And what we've done is taken the same look. And you can see, actually, that strong liberals were only slightly less likely to agree with a Biden statement simply because they were told it was made by Donald Trump, which we thought that was quite interesting. Just simply telling somebody, hey, Donald Trump said this, actually lowered strong liberals' acceptance and increased strong conservatives' acceptance of that statement. So that was kind of cool to see. Also cool to see is we saw not only the same effect when we presented participants with Donald Trump quotes, but this effect was stronger. So you can see strong liberals, when presented, self-identified strong liberals, when presented with a Trump quote that we said was made by Trump, very low acceptance rate. We see that grow quite significantly as we get to strong conservatives. So there's a massive gap when we look at ideology. And when we present an actual Trump quote, but say, okay, actually Biden said these things, and then we give them Trump quotes. This was also quite interesting because strong liberals were almost twice as likely to agree with that statement, simply because we said this was made by Biden. Also, really interesting to note, in all cases, everybody seemed to agree more with Anthony Fauci. So this is kind of my little silver lining. I was kind of happy to see anytime you get consistent results like that. Okay, so the second thing we looked at was affect. So we used the independent variable instead of self-identification on liberal conservative scale. We looked at, how do you feel towards these particular candidates? 1, very cold, 7, very warm. Quick look at that summary data. And here's what we found. So first, looking at the control group and limiting it only to the Donald Trump and Joe Biden quotes, this is before we're looking at the Fauci quotes, we kind of see what we would expect. So on the left, we have feeling towards Donald Trump as our independent variable. And the coefficient here, when given told they were reading a Donald Trump quote, being given an actual Donald Trump quote, as feeling towards Donald Trump increased, acceptance of those actual Trump quotes increased. The same for actual Biden quotes when they were told they were made by Joe Biden. And we see a similar trend for feeling towards Joe Biden as well. Almost identical when we look at feeling towards Biden and Biden quotes and feeling towards Trump and actual Trump quotes. It was interesting, though, that the acceptance, or in this case, the rejection of a Trump quote that we truthfully tell you was made by Trump is much lower than rejection by people who felt more strongly towards Trump or more warmly. So here's our test group. Same quotes, but we flipped the attribution. And this was kind of interesting as well. This was kind of the first, oh my gosh, this is a big finding. We see on the left a similar, if I can pull it back, we see this similar pattern. However, in our test group, when people were presented with Trump quotes that we said, hey, no, Joe Biden said this, feeling towards Joe Biden, there was a positive correlation. So as people felt more warmly towards Joe Biden, they were more likely to accept a statement made by Donald Trump simply because we said Joe Biden said this. So again, this is more evidence that affect matters. Then we pulled out the Fauci quotes. And again, there's a similar pattern that we saw. This is when they're primed with correctly attributed Biden quotes, correctly attributed Trump quotes. This is our control group. And then we throw in that first deception, like, okay, Biden said these things. He actually said these things. Here's two more quotes that actually we know Fauci made, but the respondents were said Biden made them. We still see kind of this similar to the control group with Biden and Trump quotes. There is a similar sort of reaction. I'm going to start speeding up because I just looked at my timer. But again, sort of this aha moment, which really gets to the crux of what we're trying to measure. How does affective polarization influence whether or not we're going to agree or disagree with a medical expert? We saw kind of a similar thing when primed with Trump quotes that we said were made by Biden. Warmth and warmness, take your pick, increased. As it increased towards Biden, people were more likely to accept a Fauci quote. When primed with a series of Trump quotes that we said were made by Biden. So if you're confused a little bit by this, just think about the poor people who took this survey. So it does get a little of a mouthful at times. So last, and I'm really going to go through this really quickly. We really wanted to sort of isolate, this is sort of like a theoretical model of how we could compare identical Fauci quotes, so pairs of identical Fauci quotes. Again, I'm going to have to go through this really quickly. Big takeaway, we found that when given Trump quotes in the control group and then provided with a Fauci quote, we had similar correlation as to when people were given Trump quotes that we said were made by Biden and then presented them with those identical Fauci quotes. So this is, here's a Fauci quote, but Trump said it. Here's a Fauci quote, but Biden said it. After being primed with here's a Trump quote and Trump said it, or here's a Trump quote and Biden said it. So I'm going to slide through these really quickly because I see I'm short of time, and kind of touch on the expectations. So we mostly confirmed what we expected to see with respect to these positive relationships between self-identified ideology and acceptance of policy recommendations for COVID. I do have a TLDR, too long didn't read version here because I expected I'd be short on time. Yes, it seems affective polarization affects perception of proper policy responses to a pandemic. The final bit, this will be 30 seconds. It's always good to have more than you need. We also looked at, like, why does it matter? Like, how does this matter in social media? Drawing upon roughly 10 million tweets we gathered in the 1 month prior to the election. And we did a content analysis to sort of look at positive and negative sentiment. So what's the Twitter sphere saying about Anthony Fauci, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden when they're talking about coronavirus? And we expected that people would be more, we'd see this affective polarization directed more towards politicians than towards a scientist or leading viral infectious disease expert. And big surprise, people were fairly negative when they talked about coronavirus in the month leading up to the election. But then we compared, negative sentiment towards Fauci, the green line, versus negative sentiment towards Joe Biden. And we found people were increasingly more negative towards Anthony Fauci when talking about coronavirus in Twitter as the election drew near. And we saw the same, surprisingly, when we looked at affect towards Trump. So this was kind of a first sign. This affective polarization wasn't being limited just to politicians. It was being directed towards a major medical figure who is leading the charge on how we're going to address this crisis. I've used up my 30 seconds extra time. There was some network analysis. It's all in the paper. I've got TLDR, too long didn't read. People got more hostile towards Anthony Fauci on Twitter as the election increased and or drew near. And it seemed like they just wanted to argue COVID politics. There really wasn't more of a reasoned approach that we expected, probably stupidly so, because we're talking about Twitter. Future research, we'd like to dig into these extra causal variables that might be influencing sort of these assessments. We'd like to look at a different population, likely kind of a two-stage study in Twitter where we can correlate the types of responses on Twitter and then pull the data out and estimate the partisanship of these people in these networks to sort of help us get to a more informed conclusion. And last, we put a lot of effort into this survey, and it would be great to share it with other researchers who can hopefully do even more and find out more than we have. So with that, thank you so much for your time. And
well, thank you very much, Professor Vorst, for that stimulating presentation. Our next presenter is Laura Wessel from Georgia Southern University, and her presentation is entitled "The Influence of Party ID on COVID-19 Messaging." Professor Wessel, please proceed. You may need to unmute your microphone.
Excuse me, yes, that was the first option, or the first important thing to do. When I hit share screen, I don't see my PowerPoint outline up here. I may have made some kind of mistake. Let me just look real quickly. If I don't find it in the next 10 seconds, I can proceed without it. Okay. Okay. Well, it looks like I'm not going to be able to share screen, but I think I can just kind of talk through this while I look at the PowerPoint outline. Of course, if anybody would like a copy, I'm more than happy to share. So this is a really great segue because the focus of my paper was related to how did the issue of COVID-19 become politicized in the first place. I think scholars and others observed that within weeks of the announcement of the pandemic, we started to see divisions towards public health recommendations, and that those divisions were correlated to some degree with party identification. So my main concern was, how did the divisions begin? My specific research question: why did party identification become relevant in explaining public reactions to COVID-19 messaging? In deciding how to approach the influence of political ideology, what I decided to do was to look at the early messaging related to COVID-19. I chose the President of the United States as the unit of analysis because the President, due to the bully pulpit in general and due to his personal interest, okay, I think I can pull my slides up now. Due to his individual personality, we saw that it was going to be likely. I kind of lost my train of thought there while I'm trying to pull up the thing, so hang on. And now I lost everybody. Okay, my share screen button has disappeared from the top of my bar. I don't know what that means. So I know everybody, we're a little crunched for time here. So I'm just going to keep going with the discussion. And if anybody has any questions as I go through or has any concerns, obviously go ahead and interrupt me. So again, I was looking at party identification and how it became relevant in explaining public reactions to COVID-19 messaging. And I hypothesized that political ideology is necessary in order to understand these political divisions. Now, in terms of political ideology, I think most of us in the room have a pretty good sense of its influence, but we know it represents our view towards government, and that political ideology is considered a deep psychological attachment. Once we develop a psychological attachment, it's difficult to let go. So we all are as we are socialized through life, develop general attitudes, and those general attitudes inform our, general values inform our attitudes toward government policy. We know that we're socialized, and when it comes to political ideology, it's not something that we're born with. Now, is party identification an appropriate measure for political ideology? I think there are some good points in the research on either side. My assertion as it relates to this research is that while political ideology is theoretically interesting, if we want to look at public reactions to COVID-19 messaging, we have to do so in the context of a two-party system. For better or worse, that is the reality of our system. So I approached this research question through a content analysis, and specifically, I wanted to do a content analysis of COVID-related messaging during the first 6 months of the pandemic. Asserting that early messaging set that is significant both in terms of short-term reactions and long-term reactions that we are still seeing in 2021. I think we're all well aware that the political environment when the pandemic began was already pretty divided, and that we have low trust in government. In January of 2020, 35% of Americans reported having either a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the federal government, indicating the majority of Americans did not have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the federal government. And of course, that's a trend we've been seeing since the late 60s, early 1970s. All right, so in pursuing the content analysis, a big decision was, well, whose content will I analyze? Again, I decided to go with the President of the United States, number one, because of the bully pulpit and the fact that the president, generally any president, has a larger audience than other political figures. And if we look back to 2020, it was the president who took the lead on COVID-19 related information. So I did a content analysis of direct messaging from the president. I tried really hard to stay away from media interpretation. So I looked specifically at the president's own words in 3 settings: the White House Coronavirus Task Force, the president's public events and travel with press in attendance, and then of course, social media, most specifically Twitter. Okay. All right, so in terms of the White House Coronavirus Task Force and the daily briefings, these were on-camera briefings between March 14th and April 24th of 2020. There were a total of 20 briefings. In terms of general information, let me just say something about this structure real quick. The president led every coronavirus task force briefing unless he was not there. And my point is he put the vice president at the time in charge of the task force, but the structure of the daily briefings was the president would speak first, give prepared remarks, then invite other members of the task force to participate, then return to the podium and answer questions from reporters. Okay, so again, there were 20 briefings in this first set of the coronavirus task force briefings. The president spoke about masks at 16 of the 20 briefings, but interestingly, those 16 messages were all about mask distribution. The president only talked about mask messaging in the context of public health on 4 occasions during his prepared remarks. So again, I have a full content analysis of all of the president's comments related to mask usage during the days of the coronavirus task force. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to highlight 3 examples. The first is from the March 30 and 31st briefings, and you can't see the messages, they're up on my screen, but the theme that I want to note is that the president really emphasized the voluntary nature of wearing a face mask. Now, again, March 30th and 31st, this is the first messaging the president gives in the context of the coronavirus task force. It's notable that in this first messaging during his prepared remarks, he criticized doctors. Part of the quote goes, "Doctors, they'll come back and say, wear masks for the rest of our lives. We have to wear masks." So that's one example. A second relevant example is from April 3rd. April 3rd is a critical day in terms of messaging from the president, because this was the day that the CDC released new guidance suggesting that the transmission of COVID from asymptomatic people was more significant than had previously been stated. So the president, during his prepared remarks at the coronavirus task force briefing, talked about that. It's notable that in his first prepared remarks after this new guidance, he used the word voluntary 7 times in the first prepared remark that he gave. Okay. All right. A third example from the White House Coronavirus Task Force I wanted to mention relates to the April 16th briefing. This briefing is particularly relevant because it was on this day that the topic of the briefing was the reopening of the states and how best to do that. This is a short quote, so I'll go ahead and give the president's quote in his prepared remarks. "Vigorous hygiene, teleworking when possible, staying at home if you feel sick, maintaining social distance, sanitizing commonly used surfaces, and being highly conscious of surroundings. Those are our weapons, and they're very powerful weapons indeed." The reason that messaging is especially important is the president did not mention face masks as an example of one of the weapons, as he phrased it, to fight COVID-19. Okay. All right. So those are the prepared remarks of the president during the White House Coronavirus Task Force. And again, he only gave attention to the public health recommendation to wear masks in 4 out of those 20 briefings. Questions from the reporters, completely different situation. Reporters pretty regularly asked President Trump questions about mask usage. Before talking about that real briefly, it's important to note, as others have mentioned this morning, the role of tone. We know that ideology, our attitudes, our values are influenced by cognitive and affective components. Cognitive, the information we receive; affective, the emotional component of our attitudes. The tone of the briefings arguably contributes to the influence of the affective component. So I have several examples written, but just as one example to note the tone between the White House, between the president and the members of the White House press corps. President Trump said to John Carl of ABC, "Look, you're a third-rate reporter, and what you just said is a disgrace. You will never make it." There are several examples of that, and they're important to my analysis because, again, if we're trying to explain why political ideology is relevant in explaining public reactions to the president's messaging, we have to consider not just the information presented, but the tone, the way that it's presented. I mentioned that reporters regularly asked the president questions about mask usage during the task force briefings. One example of a question the president answered was, "Well, why are you not wearing a mask?" If you do a content analysis of the president's response, there's that common theme of reminder that it's a recommendation. And importantly, he said several times that he would not be doing it himself. Okay. All right. So I said I did a content analysis of the president's early messaging about masks in 3 settings. The first, the White House Coronavirus Task Force. The next thing I did was look at the president's messaging at public events. I did a content analysis of the president's public events between April 3rd, the day when the health recommendation to wear a mask occurred, and July 30th. The president attended 86 events during that time period, and he spoke with the press a total of 115 times. Okay. Out of the 115 times the president spoke or expressed, the president, excuse me, spoke in front of the press, he wore a mask at one of the events and did not wear a mask at 114 of the events. So that, in terms of the symbolism of the president wearing a mask, the content analysis reveals he did not do that very often. In fact, he did it once. When he was asked about this from reporters, I just highlighted one example of when he was visiting a Ford plant. He said, "I wore one in the back area, but I didn't want to give the press the pleasure of seeing it." A second comment, "Actually, I had a mask on. I sort of liked the way I looked. I thought it was okay. It was a dark black mask, and I thought it looked okay. Looked like the Lone Ranger." It goes on from there. You know, the significance of these types of interactions with reporters continue with this theme of voluntary criticizing other institutions, in this case, the press. Okay. All right. So again, summary point out of the 115 events the president attended during this period of analysis, 86 events, 115 interactions with the president. The president wore a mask one time. Okay. The third area where I did a content analysis of the president's direct messaging was social media, Twitter. Just a couple of quick examples. On May 25th, the president retweeted a post from Fox News's Brit Hume of Biden. I think we've all seen this photo with the caption, "This might help explain why Trump doesn't like to wear a mask in public." It was a clear criticism and politicization of now President Biden. On July 20th, the president posted a photograph of himself wearing a mask with the caption, "We are united in our effort to defeat the invisible China virus." And many people say that it is patriotic to wear a face mask when you can't socially distance. There is nobody more patriotic than me, your favorite president. So to summarize, in terms of the findings of the content analyses of these three different areas in which the president spoke directly to the American people, I noticed a focus on production and distribution of masks as opposed to the public health recommendation. There was a significant emphasis on choice, the use of the word voluntary in particular, an unwillingness to model mask wearing behavior, a negative view of other institutions, from doctors to the news media to other political figures and other public health messengers. Dr. Fauci, which was just talked about, is a good example. And then finally, the last theme from the president's early messaging, an ongoing need to examine the role of tone. Again, I did a content analysis, for example, of every White House coronavirus task force briefing. And while it's important to note that information, I think future research needs to do a better job than I did of looking at some of the nonverbal messaging, the eye rolling, the things like sarcasm. And I am currently looking at how to extend that particular aspect of this analysis. Okay, so my research question looked at what potential influence this early messaging had, if it had any at all. So the next step after doing the content analyses of the president's statements was to look at public attitudes about the use of masks. In January of 2020, 59% of Americans aligned with either the Republican or the Democratic parties, and pretty evenly split, about 29% Republican, 30% Democrat, 39% independents. And so in the table I'm presenting, which sadly you cannot see right now, but the table is pretty basic. It just looks at mask attitudes and public opinion during the spring and summer of 2020. I used Gallup data that asked people their reactions to wearing masks and the percentage of, and it's broken down by party affiliation. So bottom line, in the first week following the April 3rd public health recommendations, a little more than half, about 61% of Democrats were already reporting wearing masks. That number was 46% for independents and 42% for Republicans. By the time we get to the first week of August, 99% of Democrats report wearing a mask, 91% of independents, and 80% of Republicans. And that 80% is the highest number of Republicans who reported wearing a mask during that time period. So, some implications from this research. First of all, I want to address some of the limitations of the analysis. You know, I specifically made the decision to only look at the president's messaging. I made this decision because of the long history of presidency scholarship that focuses on the president himself as the messenger in chief when it comes to national and international crises. However, a downside to limiting the analysis to just the president's commentary, you know, it may come off as biased because there was certainly political messaging from other Republicans and Democrats that differed from the president's. But again, I thought it was important to focus on the messaging of the person leading the messaging at the time. But surely an extension of this analysis to include more variables would be useful, and particularly the role of tone. Another implication of this research that I think is especially important is I see this as a recommendation for public health officials. I don't think most public health officials have a working knowledge of political ideology the way that we all do. And yet evidence suggests, and I think we're all showing kind of similar evidence in our presentations, that this pandemic has been politicized. It is likely not to be the last pandemic to be politicized. So it seems useful to me that public health officials, when crafting and delivering public health information, have an awareness and working knowledge of political ideology and its significance. And then one last point, just in terms of ongoing research, you know, and I noticed Eric mentioned this in his presentation as well, just this idea of the messenger versus the message itself. It seems with COVID and likely with other events, our willingness to listen to the messenger depends on how closely their ideology aligns with our own. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Professor Russell, for that stimulating presentation. Next and final presentation is by Anita Mannion of the University of Missouri at St. Louis. And the title of her presentation is Political Identity and Beliefs About Stolen Elections in the American Electorate. Professor Mannion, please proceed.
Hi, thank you. Let's see. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I am presenting today on behalf of myself and my co-authors, David Kimball and Adriano Udani. And probably like most of you, we were stunned as we watched the insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th, which marked the first organized assault on the seat of American government since the War of 1812. But this time, the insurrectionists were homegrown terrorists rather than a foreign army. They were fueled by the unsubstantiated claims that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. And that made us question, how do a significant number of Americans come to believe the election was stolen and act on these false allegations? So that is what drove this project for us. And as we considered it, we see three crucial elements that help produce the hostility on January 6th. The first, and we use this sort of fire analogy, the fuel, is the growth of effective polarization means that a large segment of the public is susceptible to false claims and motivated to political action. Then we have what we view as the tender and the spark. We had President Trump providing the spark by turbocharging the Republican claims of voter fraud and taking the frequency and the incendiary nature of those allegations to a whole new level. And then we had the other Republican leaders who, rather than correcting the president's false claims of a stolen election, many acted as an accelerant. They amplified those claims. So these elements combine to produce an American public that's bitterly divided over the fairness of the 2020 election and the events surrounding January 6th. And Eric pointed out that, even public health officials like Dr. Fauci have now been politicized through this process. And the same holds true for election administration officials as well. So that's part of this issue. Alan did some of my work for me, so we have basically the same figure here, so I won't spend too much time on this. But we too were trying to illustrate the growth and effective polarization. And as he mentioned, we have this partisanship that's increasingly become intertwined with other aspects of our identity. And then we've had recent national elections that have been heavily contested and had close outcomes. So this increases the stakes for partisan conflict. And then we also have the growth of partisan news, which contributes to this heightened environment, which we will also touch on. And so this effective partisan polarization, like Alan discussed, we see historic gaps in preferences for candidates and parties on that warmth feeling thermometer. Another indicator of that hardening partisanship is among respondents in the 2020 ANES survey, 44% identified as strong partisans, which is the highest share since they started measuring that decades ago. So why do we care about this? One byproduct of effective polarization is it increases one's willingness to believe bad things about their political opponents. And we've seen that whether it's about the pandemic or about elections. We also hypothesize that partisan biases influence beliefs about the types of people who are likely to commit voter fraud. So to test that, we ran an experiment used in a module of the 2017 CCES survey. And each respondent was shown 2 profiles of hypothetical voters and then asked which voter is more likely to cast an illegal ballot. The profiles of each hypothetical voter included 8 randomly assigned attributes: sex, race, age, party, citizenship, language, occupation, and whether the person has a criminal record. And so respondents went through 4 different activities with people who had different attributes and tried to say how likely they were to cast an illegal ballot. So the 3 coefficients that mattered in our experiment were partisanship, citizenship, and criminal record. So since we're testing for partisan biases, as you can see, we present the results in the red being Republican respondents and blue being Democratic respondents. And they were in large agreement about people who were not US citizens were the ones who were more likely to cast an illegal ballot. People who had a criminal record were more likely to cast the illegal ballot. But then we see that partisan breakdown where Republicans are much more likely to think Democrats will cast the illegal ballot, and Democrats were much more likely to think Republicans will cast the illegal ballot. So this shows that the people of the opposite party believe that others are committing voter fraud, and these findings hold predominantly for strong partisan identifiers. So the 2020 election took place amid this resurgent partisanship. There was increased levels of contempt for political opponents, and people were willing to believe the worst about the opposition, and therefore also follow cues from party leaders. So we have this highly charged electorate that provided the fuel, and then we have, holding with that fire analogy, enter the tender and the spark. Highly charged debates about voting restrictions in the US sometimes include implicit or even explicit references to race. So we hear a lot of allegations about inner city or urban voting fraud, sometimes identifying particular cities with large African American or Latino populations. And similar rhetoric is used to link concerns about fraud to immigrants. Other works found resentment towards people of color and anti-immigrant attitudes are strong predictors of public beliefs about voting integrity. And of course, Donald Trump has contributed to this with his rhetoric about voter fraud, about cities that he identifies that have large minority populations, and his explicit anti-immigrant allegations of voter fraud. So in our 2017 national sample of US voters, we asked respondents, what percentage of people who commit voter fraud in this country would you say are white, immigrant, or Black? So asking them to identify the percentage of the fraud committed by each of those groups. And in this 2017 sample, they estimated that 46% of voter fraud was committed by whites, 33% by Blacks, and 37% immigrants. While we don't know the exact percentages that these different groups commit voter fraud, we know that voter fraud is exceedingly rare, and we know that these are the ratios of the population. So if we just assume that these groups commit voter fraud at the same rates, that means the respondents are grossly overestimating the amount of voter fraud committed by immigrants and Blacks and underestimating the amount of voter fraud committed by whites. These might trigger you as you start to look at some of these tweets, but this is just a sampling of tweets from the 2 weeks after the election. We went ahead and threw in one from 2016 to remind you this wasn't a new phenomenon in 2020, these allegations of voter fraud. But so if the Republican leader's long history of voter fraud allegations and the public's racially biased stereotypes of criminals serves as the tinder, then Donald Trump's rhetoric was the spark that took these voter fraud claims to a new level in 2020. Before he was banned, Twitter was one of his most frequent means of communication. And just to put that in context, between Election Day and December 17th, 2020, so 45 days, the former president posted 729 tweets in that time period. That's more tweets than I've ever posted in my life. Okay, and 69% of those were about the election. These messages were also spread by his followers and amplified by other members of his party. Roughly 4 in 10 of his most liked tweets contain false claims about the 2020 election. So that's the spark. And our next stage is the accelerant. The public tends to mimic arguments made by political leaders they trust. And so we could have had a situation where most political leaders could have disavowed or contradicted Trump's baseless allegations of election fraud, and then perhaps public opinion wouldn't be so polarized. But that's not what happened. Rather than correcting those claims, they either tried to dodge the questions or amplified those claims, acting as accelerants. So again, this is just a smattering of some of the tweets, the appearances, including the Arizona Republican Party retweeting, "I'm willing to give my life for this fight," and then "he is, are you?" And that was just on December 8th. So in a review of congressional electronic newsletters from 2010 to 2021 by Brown and Cormack, Republicans' messages to constituents mention voter fraud much more than Democrats, particularly related to Trump's election. These messages, the formal messages, the informal messages, the news appearances, they matter because they provide signals to the public about what to believe. So we had a situation in 2020 where a sitting president refused to accept his electoral loss, and according to reports, conspired with others to overturn the results of a free and fair election. Part of that strategy was to convince tens of millions of Americans that the election was rigged. And in that aspect, Trump and his allies were very successful. We have a situation where this myth of stolen election moved from a fringe conspiracy to being accepted by the majority of Republicans who still believe the election was rigged and Donald Trump is the rightful president. Even though election officials from both parties spoke out to say the 2020 election was free and fair, allegations of voter fraud were found to be unsubstantiated in over 60 lawsuits, and President Trump's own agency declared the 2020 election to be the most secure in American history. However, that message got drowned out by the message from Trump, other Republican leaders, and conservative media outlets that came through loud and clear. The 2020 election was stolen from Trump, and we have to do something about it. So elite rhetoric, one area it was really polarized on was how we should adjust to the COVID pandemic. How should we ensure that everyone had access to the vote? And voting by mail became one of those flashpoint issues. Even though Trump has voted by mail many times, he and other Republican leaders characterized voting by mail as fraudulent. So to kind of test this idea of this divisiveness influencing our policy choices as well, In one survey we fielded in 2015, voting by mail was strongly opposed by 25% of Democrats and 43% of Republicans, so a relatively modest gap in preferences. But when we asked the same question on another survey conducted just after the 2020 election, what you're looking at here, voting by mail was strongly opposed by 11% of Democrats and 71% of Republicans. So it seems very clear that the messages that voters were receiving by party elites was influencing them. And that was exacerbated by their political knowledge. You can see those with high political knowledge had more partisan policy feelings about voting by mail. So Republicans with high knowledge were more likely to oppose it, while Democrats with high knowledge were less likely to oppose it. And then here we have beliefs about January 6th by party identification. So given that party identification is associated with wanting to see your side win, partisanship heavily covered our public reactions to what happened on January 6th and still influences people's idea of if we should have an investigation around this, should people be prosecuted, we have different hindsight on this event. So to illustrate this, we summarized data from the Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey, which was conducted from April to August in 2021. This survey included several questions about January 6th, some of which are on your screen right now. Since party identification develops and shapes public opinion in different ways across racial groups, we just summarize evaluations from white respondents in this table. So as you can see, strong Democrats and strong Republicans hold diametrically opposed interpretations of January 6th. I've highlighted two issues here where you see almost all strong Democrats agreeing that January 6th was a coordinated act of insurrection against the United States, and Trump encouraged or incited the attack and shares blame for what happened. Very few strong Republicans feeling that way. Meanwhile, literally 1%, which could have been a response error, right, of strong Democrats say there was voter fraud and Trump was right to challenge the election results, where the majority of strong Republicans agree with that as well as the other two statements. So very different perceptions about what happened. So in conclusion, this isn't a story about an aberration that happened in the 2020 election and it's now in our rear view and we can move on from it, which I think is what a lot of people hoped was going to happen. Instead, this is an ongoing threat to our democracy. While Donald Trump might have been the spark that ignited the big lie about rigged elections, similar rhetoric and allegations have spread like wildfire. And they're being used, we see these in races all across the country. In the California primary, these allegations were happening before voting even happened, right? And the former president's chiming in on those. And it seems like this big lie has gained traction. You know, things that would keep you from engaging in this sort of rhetoric might be fear of losing elections or losing fundraising, but instead those candidates have done the opposite. Here in Missouri, Josh Hawley has done tremendous fundraising off of this sort of rhetoric. So as of July 2021, of the nearly 700 Republicans who filed their paperwork to run for Congress in 2022, at least a third embraced Trump's false claims about his defeat. And polling indicates that a majority of Republicans want Trump to remain a major political figure and a plurality want him to run for president in 2024. Election officials at the state and local level who used to conduct their work in relative anonymity are now subject to verbal attacks, death threats, and many are resigning. So we have a highly polarized electorate combined with a partisan effort to undermine the legitimacy of elections, and that's created a really dangerous period for our democracy. In this paper, we offer a less rational picture of polarization. Rather than just being the result of policy disagreements, effective polarization contributes to the policy disagreements, and it undermines support for democratic values. We've become better sorted by more often changing our ideology and our issue positions to bring them in alignment with their partisanship, sort of like voting by mail, rather than the other way around. And effective polarization and anger mobilizes people to engage in the political process, which can be a good thing, but these traits are also associated with many troubling behaviors, including motivating people to differentiate themselves from the disliked party, making people more likely to dehumanize out partisans and believe the worst about political opponents, making people more likely to uncritically accept claims made by their own party leaders. And contempt for political opponents is associated with support for political violence and opposition to constitutional protections for minority rights. We also know the electorate is becoming more diverse, and racial and immigrant resentment that underlies some of the beliefs in voter fraud could undermine efforts to try to diversify the electorate. Which leads us to conclude that the forces that drove some Trump supporters to the Capitol on January 6th have not diminished, and make us wonder if we're at risk for another January 6th event. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Mannion, for that great presentation. I'm pleased to see that our panelists have all turned their videos on. I'd appreciate if you'd keep your microphones muted until the time comes for you to answer a question. And we do have a number of really interesting questions from the audience. One of the very first question I'd like to ask cuts across all 4 papers. And so I would like all of you to weigh in on that, and I'll call you one by one. And the question is this: based on your research, a member of the audience asked, to what extent was Donald Trump a cause of the patterns you're reporting on, and to what extent was he an effect of patterns that pre-existed and came from other sources? Professor Abramowitz, let's start with you.
I think the answer is both. It's very clear, I think, that partisan polarization began long before Trump became a candidate in 2015 and then became president. It's also pretty clear, I think, that the divisions became worse during his presidency, and that one difference between Trump and other recent presidents is that even though opinions, for example, of Obama and opinions of George W. Bush were very polarized, I think both Bush and Obama, to some extent, tried to avoid exacerbating these divisions, or at least didn't go out of their way to exacerbate these divisions. And whereas Donald Trump, I think, pretty clearly and consistently went out of his way to exacerbate these divisions. That was his political strategy. His whole approach to winning to running for president in 2016 and running again in 2020, and now in the period since then, has been to try to exacerbate the divisions that already exist, and because of his view that this is the road to success, is that what you do is you gin up enthusiasm among your base. And it's a base strategy. It's a strategy that's fundamentally about trying to maximize turnout among your partisan and ideological base. And it worked to some extent in 2016. It came very close to working in 2020. And now in the period since then, perhaps what we're seeing in these off-year elections is that, that strategy, again, at least a variation on it, is being employed by Republican candidates and so far with some success.
Thank you, Professor Abramowitz. So let's turn to Professor Forrest. A Trump cause or effect?
Well, I have to agree with Alan. I mean, it is a mix of both. I mean, it sort of seems like this is all moving on a continuum. We can. It'd be wrong not to point to the causes. We can measure those very easily. But the effects we don't see until they happen. I mean, they're still in the future. I mean, there might be a slight risk in focusing too much on who's to blame. I mean, we can't discount that. You have to lay blame for the causes. But because there's a risk in even polarized attitudes in coverage. We see it in the media, laying blame to great extents among analysts. So, it's an easy out to say both, especially since Alan already made a great argument for why it's both. At the risk of saying what he said, You know, I think it's best. It's more as scientists that we look at this as a continuum. For every cause we see today becomes an effect for a new cause. So, short answer again. I love the TLDRs. Probably the most. The strongest, effect, or I'm sorry, the strongest cause that we've seen on the national stage for sure. Where we go from here, anybody's guess.
Well, thank you. Let's turn to Professor Wessel. What's your view? Trump primarily a cause or largely an effect?
I'm going to go with cause. If we're speaking specifically about the COVID-19 pandemic, I agree, obviously, partisanship and even hyperpartisanship was an issue before the pandemic started, but it's really the early messaging from the president, who has the largest audience, that sets the tone, that's then followed by media organizations, partisan groups, etc.
Well, thank you.
Short but sweet.
Very good. Let's turn to Professor Mannion. Trump, cause or effect, or both?
Well, I'll largely agree with what Alan said, both cause and effect. And I think we actually lay out that argument in our paper that there's fuel before Trump, but he was a spark, right? And in some ways, a very unusual spark. But I think that if you look specifically at 2020, it's easier to make the argument that Trump is a cause. Because when it comes to 2020, he had a particular stake in it. I think one of the interesting aspects of the fraud arguments that are being made is folks who won re-election, for example, in Arizona, in the House of Representatives, argue that the election was fraudulent. Trump should have won Arizona, but their election in Arizona was legitimate, right? And so I think that those election fraud arguments specific to 2020, you can point to Trump as a big part of the cause.
Well, thank you very much.
Exact same thing in Georgia, by the way.
Thank you. One of our members of the audience had a really kind of interesting question. And this person noticed that in all four of the papers, there was a reference to rationality of one kind or another. Sometimes seen perhaps in a more positive light, sometimes in a more negative light. But what this person would like to ask is, could each of you explain briefly what you mean by rational in the context of your paper? And let's begin with Professor Mannion.
Well, when we look at policy choices and rationality, if you see, for example, I think the one policy we really illustrate in our paper is the vote by mail. Is it rational to think that vote by mail is a perfectly reasonable option in 2015 and then to completely change your mind by 2020? I think that we argue that that is irrational and that it is driven by this affectation and partisanship. And so that to make those big policy swings to align with your party and ideology rather than to align your party and ideology with your policy preferences, we argue is irrational.
Well, let's turn to Professor Abramowitz. Rationality in your paper.
Well, I want to say I completely agree with Professor Mannion on that point about the vote by mail question. However, the argument I'm making in my paper is that there is a rational, and by what I mean mainly there is ideological or policy-based foundation to this polarization that preceded Donald Trump's arrival on the scene, and that actually has increased under Trump. Because what we see is that the more ideologically divided voters are, if we look at the electorate today, what we see is that, you asked like who is it that holds these intensely negative feelings toward the opposing party, of these intense feelings of dislike and distrust, and is most susceptible to these sorts of appeals to even to believing, for example, that the election was fraudulent. It's not all voters. It's not all Democrats and Republicans. It's those who are at the most extreme. So, for example, among Republicans, like the most intense supporters of Trump are those on the far left. The most intense opponents of Trump, the most intense supporters of Trump are on the far right. The most intense opponents of Trump are on the far left. There's sort of a chicken and egg question here, though, in terms of saying, like, what comes first? Is it affective polarization or is it ideological polarization? Because it's pretty clear, I think, that these two things work together, and that they reinforce each other and contribute. Each one contributes to the other. It's very difficult to disentangle them. I would say that if you ask about affective polarization, if you think that that's primarily what's driving it, then you have to answer this question: where does that affective polarization come from? Where did it come from in the first place? Why do we become so hostile toward the opposing party? My argument is that it's growing policy division was what underlies that, and is the primary driver of it.
Thank you. Professor Wessel, you talk, at least implied strongly in your paper, the rationality, at least on the part of the president and others, and perhaps a rational response by certain voters. How do you interpret this question?
I think from the context of my research that, my assumption would be rational would be listening to the message. Irrational or making a decision based on the message. Irrational would be making a decision based on the messenger, whoever that might be. In this case, it's President Trump. But then that begs another question: is it irrational to make decisions based on party identification? I'm kind of approaching this as, yes, that's the irrational thing to do, but I don't know that I can make that claim. So it's message versus messenger in my context. But as we've been thinking through this, I'm wondering to myself, is it inherently irrational to make a decision based on the messenger, or is it always more rational to listen to the message? I don't have the answer to the question either.
Well, but a very good question. Thank you very much, Professor Wessel. Professor Duress, what does your research say about rationality or the lack thereof?
Well, I mean, from everything I've seen, it kind of supports the observation most of us have that humans are irrational. We're irrational creatures, I speak that way like I'm an android observing the human race, but we're irrational people. We're emotional people. We're driven by our own personal perspectives. James Madison touched on this, to paraphrase, if people were angels, no government would be necessary. We're not angels. We are imperfect people. Even as researchers, I know we all struggle with our perceptions of right versus wrong. But in the public, the mass public, we see it a lot every time politics is infused. So, when we're looking at this pursuit or using rationality or something that is rational as our goal, as our objective, as our thing to compare to, like Thomas and I do in our paper. We hope that people will be drawn towards or driven more by reason, by logic, by pragmatism. These are all these high-minded ideals that we hope people will strive for, not just in politics, but in whether or not they accept a certain piece of medical advice. So, I mean, that is kind of sort of from a philosophical standpoint. We aim for this high-minded, the super citizen from Roman times, this ideal member of a democracy who takes in these rational, objective things. But that's the objective. That's what we hope for. But we know the world is messy. We know that politics is messy and often driven by emotion, hatred, anger. All four of us are, and many others are really looking at the effect of affective polarization, which I really believe a lot of these answers to our questions can be found. So circling back, yeah, rationality is this concept. It's this ideal state that we hope people are drawn to. And as a side note, there probably is a danger in assuming that a doctor, a medical expert, even Anthony Fauci is immune, that he is an angel among us, or any other doctor. But so far, that's the best we've got, right? So, so those are my thoughts.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. One of our audience members wanted me to share with you that while they found your presentations very interesting and informative, they found them somewhat depressing. And so they have a question that I think, just me reading between the lines, that I think they hope will make them feel a little bit better. And the question is this: these presentations suggest that democracy in the real world is very fragile, even in a country like the United States with a long tradition of successful politics by many, many different measures. But what this person wants to know is exactly, in your judgments, exactly how fragile is American politics in American democracy in 2021? And Alan, let's begin with you.
I think that it's pretty fragile, for some of the very reasons that we've just heard, particularly from the Mannion paper. That it's kind of disturbing that Donald Trump is the first defeated presidential candidate in modern history, I think, who refused to concede the election, and has continued since then to promote these baseless claims of voter fraud. And the most shocking thing to me, indeed, was the support that he's gotten from many of his fellow Republicans, and the fact that the large majority of Republican voters continue to support him and accept these baseless claims. And it's very disturbing because accepting the verdict of elections and the willingness to the peaceful transfer of power between parties is the fundamental. If there's one single thing that you have to say is absolutely essential in a functioning representative democracy, that's what it is. And now, for the first time, it's been questioned. And going forward, there's no reason to think it can't happen again. And the question I ask everyone is, what if Donald Trump had won that election in 2020, and which he came very, very close to doing? If you look at the electoral vote and you look at the 3 states, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, decided by extremely narrow margins, even though the overall national popular vote margin was fairly large. You flip 45,000 or so votes in those 3 states, Trump wins them. We have a tie in the Electoral College. It goes to the House of Representatives, which a majority of the delegations, Republican, elects Trump president. If Donald Trump had gotten another term in the White House, does anyone think he would not have proceeded to continue to push these sorts of claims of voter fraud and to put people in place who would be more malleable this time, but within his Justice Department? And so, there's no reason to think he wouldn't do the same thing if he comes back in 2024.
Thank you. Professor Russell, what do you think about the fragility of democracy these days?
Well, I'll offer a little bit of humor and then some seriousness. And just in terms of, this is very depressing. If you ever want to have the room to yourself, turn on C-SPAN, do a content analysis of any political leaders, and everybody will leave the room. So that's my advice. On a more serious note, speaking specifically as someone who's teaching in the state of Georgia, there are still a significant proportion of the population that still believes the 2020 election is stolen and still advocate for recounts and audits every single day. Without sounding too alarmist, I'm in my 50s. This is the first time in my life I ever really had any actual concern for our democracy. Yes.
Thank you. Professor Duress, weigh in on how fragile our democracy is these days.
Well, I mean, I think democracy has always been fragile. I'll throw that possibility out there. You know, anytime you create a form of government where, again, imperfect beings are in charge of making rules for other imperfect beings, when majorities have the ability to infringe upon the rights of those in the minority. I mean, you've got a testy sort of a very fragile system that requires investment by all the participants on different levels, requires trust in the elites that are elected to these positions of power. Without this trust in these institutions, democracy is always at risk. It's arguable. I'm not going to make the claim without actually doing some more research, or I'll listen to people smarter than me, if it's at more risk today than it has been before. But I can't help but wonder, you know, isn't democracy, the democracy that we have at any given point in time, isn't that just representative to some extent of our society? I mean, the old quote of, you know, we get the government that we deserve. I mean, this is largely not to shift the blame, but, you know, it's got to be tied to the state of the particular society that manages its form of democracy. So, you know, the first response I have to that question would actually be, well, what is driving? What are the causes? You know, my first knee-jerk reaction would be social media. I'm still probing this theory. I mean, we see anecdotally how there seems to have been a rise in unrest, in these increased polarized attitudes. It seems extraordinarily unlikely that this could not have been caused by an advancement in human technology that has pushed so many of us from disparate backgrounds into the same space, into the same communication spaces at an accelerated rate that we've never seen before. So, you know, this could be driving some of you know, the tone or the feelings or the affect that we see in our society, which in turn could be leading to the type of democracy we have right now, and hence the extent to which we sense that it is very fragile at this point in history.
Well, thank you very much. Professor Manning, we'd like your views. I think you sort of answered the question, but feel free to expand on that.
Yeah, unfortunately for the person who posed this question, the research that we presented today is not super optimistic, right? And our comparative scholars would say that the government not accepting electoral defeat is a key element of, you know, democracy, and that Trump violated the value of accepting that defeat. But, you know, at heart, I'm an optimist. I would say that's not the only aspect of democracy, but certainly our democracy is fragile. And I think that in some ways, the GOP is even facing some of the results of their own work. For example, in the Georgia Senate runoff races, where if you say your vote doesn't count, it doesn't matter. Now they're worried, even Marjorie Taylor Greene is worried that this is depressing voter turnout. And then, of course, on the other side, the concern is about all of these election laws that are being passed to potentially suppress the vote. And to me, the most troubling aspect is trying to make partisan our election administration. So I think that those folks have been the stalwart of our democracy through this whole experience, and I just really hope that that doesn't get undermined.
Well, thank you very much. We have just a couple of minutes before our time expires. So I want to focus this question on Alan Abramowitz, but if we could answer very briefly, maybe everybody could have a chance to weigh in. But the question based on your paper, Alan, was if what you're saying is correct, is the tradition of coalition building in parties and elections largely a thing of the past?
I'm not sure what you mean by exactly by coalition building. If you mean like building coalitions based on sort of different kind of demographic groups in society, that different racial, ethnic, I think no, it's not. It's just that I think the coalitions are increasingly focused on policy issues, but we see this at the elite level, certainly, where the policy divide between the parties. You know, it's a little misleading right now. Everyone's focusing on the fact that the Democrats can't get their act together. The Democrats are so divided. They're not. There are 2 Democrats in the Senate who are basically the blocking the Democrats from doing what they want in terms of policy. So, the overwhelming majority of Democrats agree on a very progressive agenda. And we're seeing the same thing within the electorate. There's an increasing agreement on a liberal policy agenda among Democrats and a very conservative policy agenda, or at least anti-liberal policy agenda among Republicans. I'm not sure that they actually have an agenda, but except opposing whatever the Democrats and progressives want. So I think that, yes, there's coalition building, but it has much more of an ideological policy foundation than in the past.
Well, thank you. Briefly, would anyone else like to weigh in on the issue of coalition building? Go ahead, Laura. Laura Wessel, go ahead. And
got it. Maybe I'm just provoking another question from the question, but when I think about coalition building in the context of where we are now, I'm really curious about, and I've always been curious, are we ever going to see the end of the strong 2-party system? Given the changes within both parties, it's just an interesting way to think about that. Will this be the end of the 2-party system? I suppose I'd say no if you asked me personally, but there feels like there's something different right now that we haven't seen before in terms of the divisions. We shall see.
well, thank you very much. It's my sad task to bring our panel to a close. I want to thank our presenters and for sharing their fascinating research with us. I want to thank the audience, particularly for those good questions. In our next panel, we'll have about a 15-minute break, and our next panel is scheduled to begin at 12 noon Eastern Daylight Time. Thank you all very much.